My name is Burl, and 3 days after open-heart surgery, I came home expecting warmth from my family. Instead, I found strangers living in my room. My photographs turned face down, and my own daughter pointing at the doghouse in the yard saying, "That's where you'll live now." That moment broke something inside me, but it also forged something stronger. They thought I was helpless, forgotten, discarded. What they didn't know was that I had a key to a different future, a place they could never touch, and soon they would learn the price of betrayal. Before we begin this story, I want to ask, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. When I tell you my daughter pointed to the doghouse and said, "That's where you'll live now," you might think I'm exaggerating. But those were her exact words, sharp as glass and cold as the January wind. I had just returned from 3 days in the hospital after heart surgery. My chest still bore the fresh ache of cracked ribs and stitches, but nothing hurt more than watching my own blood treat me like less than human. The taxi had dropped me at the curb, and I walked up the icy steps with hope in my heart. I expected smiles, maybe even balloons from my grandkids, a hot meal waiting at the table. Instead, I stepped into silence. The house smelled different, not like the comforting mix of coffee and crayon wax I was used to. It smelled of someone else's aftershave. I called out, my voice echoing through the living room. "Adeline, kids." No answer, just the hum of the refrigerator. My recliner had been shoved into a corner. My magazines gone, the coffee table bare, as if no one lived there. My chest tightened, not from the surgery this time, but from a creeping dread. I walked down the hall to my room, clutching the railing like it could anchor me to sanity. The door stood half open, and I knew before I pushed it wider that something was terribly wrong. Inside my bed was covered in floral suitcases that weren't mine. A pair of large men's boots sat by the dresser, and prescription bottles with unfamiliar names lined my nightstand. My wedding photo with Martha was turned face down, as if someone couldn't bear to look at it. My shirts were squeezed to one side of the closet, pressed against dresses I'd never seen before. It was like walking into a stranger's room in a hotel, except this was my home. My chest burned as I whispered, "What have they done to me?" The front door opened, voices carried inside, and I rushed to the living room. My grandchildren, Tommy and Lily, spotted me first. They ran to me with joy in their eyes, throwing their arms around my waist. "Grandpa, you're home," they shouted. For a brief second, warmth returned, but then Adeline appeared behind them, her face hard. She didn't look at me with the love I'd counted on all these years. She looked at me like a problem to be solved. "Dad," she said flatly, "there have been some changes while you were gone. Eldon and Vera needed a place to stay, so we gave them your room." I stared at her, my breath catching. My room. Available. Her lips pressed tight, and then she gestured toward the yard. "You can stay out there. We fixed up the doghouse. It's weatherproof. There's room for a sleeping bag." The world tilted. My daughter, the little girl I once carried on my shoulders, had just exiled me to live where a pet might sleep. Tommy's face fell, and Lily clung to my hand. But Adeline's eyes stayed cold. At that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't family to her anymore. I was just a burden she wanted out of sight. The night I called from the hospital should have told me everything. My hands were still swollen from IV needles, my chest taped tight from surgery, and yet I dialed my daughter's number with the hope she'd be waiting to bring me home. Instead, her voice came through clipped, distracted, drowned by the sounds of cash registers in the background. "Dad, I'm busy. Find yourself a motel or something." The line went dead before I could answer. I sat there in the fluorescent hospital light, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, and I told myself she didn't mean it. She was overwhelmed. Maybe she didn't hear the tremor in my voice or the way I could barely hold the phone. But deep down, a seed of doubt took root. I tried calling again, left messages that went unanswered. Even when I pictured her listening later, I imagined her frowning with regret, planning to make it right. That illusion shattered the moment I walked into my old room and found strangers' medicine bottles on my nightstand. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't stress. It was deliberate. She had erased me before I even left the hospital bed. I remember sitting in the living room, staring at the family photographs turned to the wall. It was like they couldn't stand to see me staring back, reminding them of the sacrifices I'd made. Every frame told a story, me teaching Adeline how to ride a bike. Martha holding her hand at graduation, my arms around the grandchildren last Christmas. All of it silenced, smothered, flipped face down as though I'd never existed. My chest throbbed each heartbeat, reminding me I was alive, but unwelcome. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell together. Months earlier, Carl had complained about bills. His hours at work had been cut. They'd whispered about refinancing the mortgage. I dipped into my savings to help, telling myself that's what family was for. But what they wanted wasn't my presence. It was my money, my silence, my obedience. When those ran out, so did their loyalty. That night, as I sat with Tommy and Lily clinging to my arms, Adeline made her declaration plain. "This isn't your home anymore, Dad. It's ours. You don't pay rent. They do." Her tone was flat, businesslike, as if she were explaining a line item in a budget. I looked down at my grandchildren, confused, hurt, searching my face for answers, and I realized I couldn't give them any. Not then. Not without breaking apart. I asked myself over and over, where had I gone wrong? I sold my house in Detroit so they could afford this one. I moved in to help with the kids. I gave everything a man could give, and in return I was handed exile. But as I sat there, my hand on Tommy's small shoulder, I understood something deeper. They thought they had won. They believed I had nowhere else to go, no cards left to play. What they didn't know was that I carried a memory, an old key hidden away in my coat pocket, and the name of a place they had long forgotten. My life wasn't over. Their betrayal had only set the stage for what was coming. I walked down the hall toward what used to be my sanctuary, my steps slow and unsteady, each one pressing against the scar that ran down my chest. The door creaked open, and the first thing I noticed wasn't the strange suitcases or the men's boots. It was the photographs. All of them, Martha in her wedding dress, Adeline as a teenager, holding her diploma, my grandchildren at Christmas, turned face down. Someone had deliberately silenced those memories, like they didn't want me to be part of this house anymore. My hands trembled as I reached for one frame, flipping it upright. My late wife's smile beamed back at me, warm and steady, as if she were standing in the room. For a moment I felt anchored, reminded of the love I once had. But the weight of betrayal crushed it quickly. I sat on the edge of the bed that no longer smelled of my cologne or the soap I'd always used. Instead, it smelled of strangers. Vera's perfume clung to the sheets, sharp and artificial, while Eldon's aftershave lingered like smoke. My closet was split in two. My shirts pushed into the far corner, while their clothes dominated the space. I felt like an intruder in my own life, a ghost wandering through a place I had built. The questions came rushing. When had they moved in? The very day I was lying on an operating table with my chest cracked open, did Adeline plan this all along, knowing I'd be too weak to fight back? I replayed every moment leading up to this, the hushed conversations, the way Carl avoided eye contact, Adeline's sudden coldness. It all made sense now. They hadn't just forgotten me. They'd replaced me. I found myself gripping the dresser for balance, staring at Martha's folded engagement ring in the jewelry box. My voice broke as I whispered, "What would you tell me to do, Martha?" I could almost hear her answer. "Stand tall. Don't beg for crumbs where you once gave bread." Those words steadied me. When I returned to the living room, Tommy and Lily were waiting, confusion etched on their young faces. "Grandpa, why are your things in boxes?" Tommy asked. I forced a smile, brushing his hair back gently. "Sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense, son. But that doesn't mean we stop being family." My words trembled, but I meant them. The front door opened again. Adeline stepped inside with Carl trailing behind, eyes glued to his phone as usual. She barely acknowledged me, her voice firm as if this had been rehearsed. "Dad, your room was available. Eldon and Vera are family too. They needed it more than you." I clenched my fists, holding back the surge of anger threatening to break loose. "And what about me?" I asked quietly. "Where do I belong?" Her lips curved into something crueler than a smile. She pointed toward the yard, her voice cold as steel. "We set up the doghouse for you. It's weatherproof. There's room for a sleeping bag." The words sliced through me sharper than any surgeon's blade. I looked at her, my daughter, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as the little girl I'd raised, but as a stranger. The porch light glared down on us like a spotlight, exposing every line on my face, every tremor in my hands. Adeline's words still echoed in my ears, the doghouse. I thought I had misheard, but no, her eyes didn't waver, her jaw was set like stone. Carl avoided my gaze, staring at his phone as if the glowing screen could shield him from guilt. Eldon crossed his arms with the smugness of a man who had just claimed a prize he hadn't earned, while Vera clutched her purse and smirked as though she'd won some twisted victory. My knees wobbled not from weakness, but from the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. "You mean to tell me," I said slowly, each word measured, "that while I lay in a hospital bed fighting for my life, you moved strangers into my room and prepared an animal shelter for me?" Adeline's response was chilling. "It's not like that. Don't be dramatic. It's just temporary." Temporary. The words stung. Temporary until what? Until I died, until they squeezed the last cent of value from me. Tommy tugged at her sleeve, his voice rising with childlike indignation. "Mommy, Grandpa can't sleep outside. He just got out of the hospital." Lily's little hands clung to my arm, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you being mean to Grandpa?" For a split second, I thought Adeline might falter, but she only hardened further. "Eldon and Vera are paying rent. Grandpa isn't." The words dropped like ice into the room. That was the truth laid bare. I wasn't family anymore. I was a ledger entry, a liability compared to the profit of 2 paying tenants. My chest ached, but not from the surgical scar. This pain was deeper, the kind that carves into your spirit. I looked from face to face, my daughter's cold eyes, Carl's cowardice, Eldon's arrogance, Vera's entitlement. And I realized they all expected me to argue, to plead for my place, to collapse into the role of a helpless old man. But I didn't. Instead, I straightened my back, pulling Lily gently into my arms and placing a hand on Tommy's shoulder. My voice came out calm, almost too calm for the storm inside me. "I see. I understand perfectly now." Adeline tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's just until we figure things out." I met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something in me she hadn't expected: resolve. "Until you need money again," I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Carl's thumbs froze mid-scroll. Eldon shifted uncomfortably. Vera pursed her lips. and Adeline's cheeks flushed with something that looked dangerously close to shame. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I simply turned toward the hallway, each step deliberate, my suitcase dragging behind me. Tommy's voice trembled as he called after me, "Grandpa, where are you going?" I paused at the doorframe, my back to them all. "Somewhere else, sweetheart. Somewhere better." And though my heart was heavy, something inside me hardened into steel. They thought they had won. They thought they'd caged me in a doghouse. What they didn't know was that I had a key that would change everything. I shut the door to what had been my room for 2 years and stood there for a long moment, staring at the stranger's belongings crowding out my own. Vera's dresses hung where Martha's had once swayed gently in the closet. Eldon's boots were planted beside the bed as though he'd earned the right to stand in my place. Even the photographs of my family had been stuffed into a drawer, turned face down like a crime scene someone didn't want witnessed. My chest throbbed, not from stitches this time, but from the kind of ache that medicine couldn't heal. I moved slowly, folding my shirts the way Martha used to fold them when we were young. Each crease felt like an act of defiance, a refusal to let them erase me completely. In the corner, Tommy and Lily watched silently, their small eyes wide with confusion. "Grandpa, are you leaving?" Tommy asked, his voice cracking. I forced a smile I didn't feel. "Not leaving, son. Just going somewhere else for a while." The truth was bitter but clear. I didn't belong here anymore. Not in this house. Not under my daughter's roof. Adeline's words had made that plain. "You don't pay rent." They do. That sentence rang louder than any rejection I'd ever endured. It wasn't love that bound me to her anymore, it was utility. And when that utility dried up, so did her loyalty. I picked up the small box that held Martha's engagement ring and slipped my own wedding band back onto my finger. The metal was cool against my skin, but it steadied me. It reminded me of vows I had once made and kept promises of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. I had lived those values. Adeline had chosen to abandon them. That was her shame, not mine. Down the hall, I heard muffled voices, Carl's cowardly murmur, Eldon's self-satisfied tone. Adeline explaining to the children that Grandpa needs to stay somewhere else for a while. Each word was a dagger, but each one also hardened my resolve. They thought I had no choice but to accept their cruelty. They thought I had nowhere to go. But they were wrong. I zipped my suitcase shut and wheeled it into the living room. The porch light cast a harsh glow on their faces as I passed. None of them tried to stop me. Not even Adeline, who simply crossed her arms, her lips pressed thin. I looked at her one last time and said quietly, "I understand perfectly now. Thank you for showing me who you really are." The cold air outside bit through my coat as I stepped onto the driveway. My breath came out in white clouds, but strangely, I didn't feel cold. I felt lighter, even as tears threatened to spill. A taxi's headlights appeared at the end of the street. I had called earlier, my voice steady, when I realized there was nothing left for me here. As I climbed into the back seat, Tommy and Lily's faces pressed against the window, waving frantically. I raised a trembling hand in return. They didn't know where I was going, and truth be told, neither did Adeline or Carl. But I knew. I had an address, an old letter, and a key hidden in my coat pocket. They had exiled me to a doghouse, but soon they would learn that I had an entire house of my own, one they could never touch. The taxi's engine hummed steadily as Chicago's winter blurred past my window streetlights, casting red and gold streaks across the wet pavement. I sat with my suitcase clutched to my chest, the stitches beneath my shirt tugging each time I shifted. The driver glanced back at me in the mirror, his eyes curious but kind. "Where to, sir?" he asked. My lips felt dry as I answered New Buffalo, Michigan. It wasn't a random choice. I had carried that address in my mind for years, tucked into a corner of memory I thought I'd never need. Olson Manor. My Uncle Harlan's estate, a place I hadn't seen since boyhood. Most people in the family dismissed him as eccentric, a recluse, who preferred books to gatherings. But I remembered him differently. He was the only one who ever looked me straight in the eye and told me kindness is not weakness, Burl. Don't forget that. At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now, after what my daughter had done, his words burned with truth. The ride was long. Snow turned to ice as the night deepened, and the world outside grew darker with each mile. I thought about Adeline, about how easily she had turned her back on me. I thought about Carl hiding behind his phone and Vera and Eldon acting as though they'd earned rights to my home. And each time the pain threatened to break me, I pressed my hand against the small brass key hidden in my coat pocket. Uncle Harlan had given it to me years ago with a half smile and no explanation. "You'll know when to use it," he'd said. At the time, I had laughed. Now I wasn't laughing. Sometime past midnight, the taxi turned onto a long gravel driveway, tires crunching over frozen ground. Through the windshield, I saw shadows of oak trees arching like a cathedral, their branches heavy with snow. And then it appeared. Olson Manor. The house rose up from the darkness, 3 stories of weathered stone and tall windows standing proud against the Michigan night. My breath caught. I hadn't seen it in decades, but it was just as I remembered, imposing, timeless waiting. The driver whistled low. "That's someplace you got there." I nodded, though a part of me still didn't believe it. Could it really be mine? Could I step out of exile and into belonging? In one night, I paid the fare, my hands trembling, and dragged my suitcase through the snow until I stood before the massive oak doors. My fingers found the 3rd stone from the left post, just as Uncle Harlan had once instructed me. I pried it loose, and there it was, the brass key, still hidden, still waiting. When the lock turned and the door opened, I stepped into silence, not emptiness, but possibility. The air smelled of cedar and old leather, of history preserved. My heart, weak and scarred, pounded with something new hope. They thought they had condemned me to a doghouse, but in truth, I had just opened the door to my rebirth. The foyer of Olson Manor greeted me with a rush of memories and dust. My footsteps echoed across the hardwood, and when I reached for the light switch, a chandelier overhead sputtered and then flooded the hall with a soft, golden glow. I stood frozen, taking it all in, the grand staircase curving upward, the carved banisters polished. Even after years of neglect, the portraits of stern-faced Olsons staring down at me from the walls. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small or unwanted. I felt part of something greater, something enduring. I set my suitcase down and wandered into the library, a room I remembered from childhood. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines still gleamed. In the center stood a massive stone fireplace, its mantel crowded with brass candlesticks and dusty picture frames. I brushed my hand across the desk, stirring a film of dust, and found a manila envelope resting neatly in the center. On its front, in Harlan's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Burl, when family disappoints you." My knees gave out, and I sat heavily in his old leather chair. The room was silent except for the pounding of my heart as I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the letter. The paper was thick, the ink steady and deliberate. I knew this day would come, Burl. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness, but weakness is not in you. This house is yours now by both right and heart. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I read the words again and again until they blurred with tears. My uncle had seen what I couldn't admit to myself, that those closest to me would one day betray me. And he had left me this sanctuary not out of pity, but out of recognition. I rose slowly, careful with my healing chest, and explored further. The kitchen was a time capsule, its 1950s appliances gleaming like relics, but still functional. The dining room table stretched long enough to seat 20, its surface scarred from decades of family feasts. Upstairs, the master bedroom overlooked Lake Michigan, the moonlight painting the frozen water in silver. On the nightstand, fresh linens were folded neatly, as though someone had been keeping the house ready. When I drew back the heavy curtains, I could see the lake stretching out to the horizon. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, a thinner, older man than I remembered, but one who was still standing, still alive, still capable. For the first time since Martha's passing, I felt possibility instead of loss. I returned to the library, sat at the desk, and opened a blank journal that had been left in the drawer. My hand shook as I wrote the first line, "Nobody needs anything from me anymore, except what I choose to give." The words steadied me, each letter reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stripped away. That night I slept in a bed that belonged to me under a roof that carried my name. Outside, the wind howled against the stone walls, but inside I felt safe. The doghouse was a memory. The betrayal was still raw, but here in Olson Manor I had found not only shelter, but dignity. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the master bedroom, gilding the frost on the glass with gold. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. The four-poster bed, the ornate wardrobe, the view of Lake Michigan stretching into the horizon. It all felt too grand for a man who had been shoved toward a doghouse only days earlier. But this wasn't a dream. This was mine. Olson Manor left in my care by a man who understood me better than my own daughter did. I rose carefully, my chest still tender, and padded into the library where I had left Uncle Harlan's letter. I read it again, savoring each word. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness. That single line hit me like a thunderclap. How many times had I allowed Adeline to lean on me, convinced myself that sacrifice was love? I sold my house in Detroit, gave her the down payment for hers, moved in to watch the children so she could work longer hours. I called it devotion. She called it convenience. And when my usefulness ran out, she cast me aside. But here in Harlan's handwriting was a validation I had longed for. I wasn't weak. I wasn't worthless. My generosity had been twisted by others into something they could exploit. Harlan saw it coming. That was why he left me this place, not just the stone and timber, but the message that I was worth more than their betrayal. I spent that day exploring every corner of the manor, reacquainting myself with the echoes of childhood visits. The attic held trunks of old clothes, travel journals, and maps marked with Harlan's notes from journeys across the world. The basement stored jars of preserves so old they'd likely turned to vinegar, but they still carried the faint scent of cherries and apples. In the garage, covered by a tarp, sat Harlan's old Studebaker, its chrome still gleaming beneath a thin layer of dust. Each discovery whispered the same truth: he had trusted me with a legacy, not abandoned me. At midday, I walked into town. The snow crunched under my boots as I passed familiar landmarks, a diner with red vinyl booths, a hardware store with its bell above the door, a church spire rising above clustered homes. People looked at me curiously, at first, then with recognition. "You're Harlan's nephew, aren't you?" the grocer asked, his eyes bright. "He talked about you all the time." The words nearly undid me. My uncle, the so-called oddball, had kept me close in his thoughts long after I assumed he'd forgotten. When I returned that evening, I lit a fire in the library. The flames crackled against the stone, filling the room with warmth. I sat in Harlan's leather chair journal in my lap and wrote, "Kindness is not weakness. It is strength when placed in the right hands." For the first time in years, I felt not like a burden, but like a man reclaiming his worth. My daughter thought she had broken me. Instead, she had set me free. The days began to form a rhythm at Olson Manor, each one carrying me further away from the humiliation I had endured, and closer to something I had almost forgotten: peace. I would wake with the sunrise spilling over Lake Michigan, its reflection shimmering like liquid gold across the icy surface. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward, while the cold air bit my face, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was intruding in someone else's home. This house was mine. The healing process was slow, but it came. I walked the long hallways to rebuild my strength, climbing the grand staircase one step at a time, until my lungs no longer burned. I dusted the shelves in the library, not out of duty, but out of gratitude, each polished surface a small act of reclaiming. The locals noticed, too. Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor from across the lane, stopped by with a pot of chicken soup one evening. "Your uncle was a good man," she told me, her eyes kind. "It's good to see life in that house again." She didn't look at me like a burden. She looked at me like I belonged. In town, the connections deepened. The waitress at the diner, Sarah, remembered me from childhood visits. "Your uncle said you had his sense of what really mattered," she said as she refilled my coffee. The words stuck with me as I walked home through the crisp air. For years, I'd been told implicitly or explicitly that I was only valuable when I was giving. But here I wasn't being measured by what I provided. I was accepted simply for being. At night, I'd sit in Harlan's chair and leaf through his journals. His handwriting filled page after page with observations about people, about the nature of family, about the dangers of mistaking silence for weakness. One line struck me so hard, I had to read it aloud. "Sometimes you must lose what you thought was home to discover where you truly belong." I leaned back, staring into the fire, and realized how true that was for me. Physically, I was mending. Emotionally, I was rediscovering my footing. I wrote daily in my own journal, now reflections that poured from me like water from a long-blocked spring. "Nobody here needs me to sacrifice myself. Nobody here demands I erase my own needs. This place allows me to simply exist." But as much as I cherished the silence, I also knew it was fragile. Somewhere out there, Adeline and Carl were living in the house I had helped them buy, smug in their certainty that I was powerless, irrelevant. They didn't know about Olson Manor. They didn't know I had been reborn within these stone walls. And I had no intention of telling them yet. I closed my journal one evening and whispered to the fire, "They'll come looking when the money runs out. And when they do, they'll find a man they don't recognize anymore." The manor grew warmer with each passing day, not just from the fires I lit in the hearths, but from the sense of belonging that wrapped itself around me like a quilt. What had started as a refuge quickly became a rebirth. I rose early each morning, made breakfast in the old mint-green kitchen, and walked the property bundled in my heavy coat. Even with my chest still tender from surgery, I felt stronger with each step, as though the house itself was lending me its endurance. Neighbors waved when I walked into town. The hardware store owner gave me a discount on supplies, saying Harlan always said you'd return someday. Those words echoed in my mind. He always said you'd return. My uncle hadn't just left me a house. He had prepared a place for me to land when the rest of the world turned cruel. The thought steadied me, reminding me I wasn't abandoned. I was chosen. I filled my days with simple routines. I cleared dust from the library and stacked logs in the fireplace. I repaired a loose hinge on the front door, my hands clumsy but determined. Every act of care stitched me tighter to the manor's history, binding me not just as its resident, but as its steward. At night, I'd open one of Harlan's journals, reading lines that felt written for me. Strength isn't proven by how much you give away, but by knowing when to stop giving to those who take without end. Each evening, I closed my own journal with an entry of my own. For the first time in years, silence doesn't feel like exile. It feels like freedom. Those words marked a turning point. In Chicago, silence meant being ignored, discarded, erased. Here it meant peace. Yet even as I embraced this new life, I knew it was a calm before the storm. Adeline's silence had grown too loud. She hadn't called to apologize. She hadn't written. That could only mean one thing: she thought she had succeeded in erasing me. She believed I had nowhere else to go, and sooner or later, when her own finances collapsed, she would come looking. I prepared quietly, not with anger, but with resolve. I contacted a lawyer in town to update my will. I secured important documents in Harlan's old desk. I even had the locks on the manor changed, not because I feared strangers, but because I knew my own daughter would try to force her way back into my life when desperation set in. Standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun sink into Lake Michigan, I whispered, "They'll see soon enough." Not a threat, but a promise. The people who had pointed me toward a doghouse would eventually find themselves standing at these gates, looking up at walls that wouldn't let them in. They thought they had broken me. In truth, they had forged me into something unrecognizable, stronger, steadier, unyielding. The doghouse had been their judgment of my worth. The manor was mine. And in its silence, I was readying myself for the day they returned. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the peace I had come to cherish. From the library window, I saw a familiar Honda pulling slowly up the driveway, followed by another car I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from a grim confirmation. I had known this day would come. My daughter hadn't called in weeks, not once to ask if I was alive after my surgery, not once to apologize. No, she had come now because she needed something. I watched as Adeline climbed out. First her movements, sharp with anger, her eyes darting up at the manor with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Carl followed more slowly, his gaze already sweeping the stone walls and tall windows like a man counting dollar signs instead of blessings. I stayed where I was, letting them take in the sight of the home they had never imagined I possessed. By the time I opened the front door, they were halfway up the porch steps. Adeline didn't wait for greetings. Her voice cracked with outrage. "How could you hide this from us, Dad? We're your family." Her words cut through the cold air, but I didn't flinch. I stood in the doorway, my hand steady on the frame, my posture firm. "The same way you hid your plans to throw me into a doghouse," I replied evenly. "You showed me no loyalty, no kindness. And now you dare speak of family." Carl stepped forward, his eyes locked on the chandelier hanging behind me in the foyer. "Do you have any idea what this place is worth?" His voice was tight with greed. "We could have helped you manage it." I almost laughed. "Manage it into whose bank account?" His face flushed red, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he brushed past me as though he had the right to inspect my home, his eyes roaming like an appraiser. Adeline lingered in the doorway, her anger faltering for just a moment as she looked at me. But her pride quickly returned. "We gave you a home for 2 years," she insisted. I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "You gave me a corner of a life I paid for. I sold my house in Detroit to make your mortgage possible. I babysat your children, cooked your meals, mowed your lawn. Don't twist generosity into debt owed." She looked startled, unprepared for the steel in my tone. For decades, I had been the quiet father, the dependable provider, the man who said yes, even when it cost me. Now, standing in the doorway of Olson Manor, I wasn't that man anymore. I wasn't broken. I wasn't dependent. I was home and I was whole. Their eyes darted past me again, to the grand staircase, the polished wood gleaming in the morning light. I knew what they saw of fortune. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't measure, was the resolve inside me. They thought they had come to reclaim a helpless old man. Instead, they had found someone they could no longer control. Carl moved through the rooms like a man on a mission, running his hand along the banisters, tapping the furniture, peering into corners, as if the house itself were a bank vault waiting to be emptied. His voice carried through the foyer. "This place has to be worth millions. The land alone with the lake view, it's a fortune, Dad. Do you realize what we could do with that kind of money? The kids' college, paying off debts, building real security." I followed him into the living room, my footsteps slow but deliberate. He was speaking of security, as though I hadn't already given them more than most parents ever could. I had sold my house, drained my savings, and sacrificed years of my life to keep their household afloat. And now he stood in my inheritance, talking about how we could use it. By we, he meant himself. Adeline trailed behind her eyes, scanning the high ceilings and oil paintings on the walls. For a moment, I caught something flicker in her expression, not admiration, but panic. She realized I was no longer at her mercy. I could see the calculation in her mind, the gears turning, searching for an angle to spin this discovery in her favor. "You should have told us about this," she said sharply. "We could have helped you take care of it." I turned to face her, my voice calm. "You mean the way you helped me when I came home from surgery, by moving strangers into my room, by pointing to a doghouse." Her face flushed, and for a heartbeat her eyes dropped. But Carl jumped in quickly, desperate to reclaim the narrative. "That was a mistake. Everyone was stressed. But this house, this could change everything for us." I studied him. For years I had excused his laziness, his excuses about hours being cut at work, his tendency to hide behind Adeline's skirt when things got tough. Now I saw him clearly, not as a struggling man, but as a parasite. He wasn't thinking about the children. He wasn't thinking about Adeline. He was thinking about himself, about what he could siphon from me. I moved toward the fireplace, resting my hand on the mantel where Uncle Harlan's journals still sat. "This house isn't for sale. Not for you, not for anyone." Carl's face hardened, his greed now exposed. "You don't understand, old man. You can't manage a place like this by yourself. You'll need help. Our help." A smile tugged at my lips, though there was no humor in it. "The last time I needed help, you left me to rot in a hospital. Forgive me if I don't trust your definition of family." Adeline stepped closer, her voice trembling with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Dad, please, don't shut us out. We're your blood." I met her eyes steadily. "Blood doesn't make family. Loyalty does." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the crackle of the fire. For the first time, I saw the truth settle in Adeline's face. She realized she no longer held the strings. Adeline lingered in the center of the room, her shoulders stiff, her eyes darting between me and Carl. I could see her scrambling to find footing, the practiced tactics of guilt and manipulation lining up on her tongue. "Dad," she began softly, her voice suddenly breaking. "I made one mistake. One bad decision when I was overwhelmed. And now you're throwing away our whole relationship because of it." I let the words hang in the air, my silence forcing her to hear them herself. Finally, I answered, my voice low but steady. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up the groceries. A mistake is being late for dinner." "You didn't make a mistake, Adeline. You planned this. You moved people into my room while I was lying on an operating table. You turned down my calls. You pointed me to a doghouse like I was less than human. That wasn't stress. That was choice. Her eyes watered, but I knew those tears. I had seen them before, used as tools, weapons designed to soften my heart. But standing in Olson Manor, surrounded by the legacy Uncle Harland had left me, those tears no longer worked. I had learned the difference between real grief and crocodile tears. Carl's patience snapped. He slammed his hand on the back of a chair, rattling it against the wooden floor. You're being unreasonable. We're your family. Families share. I straightened, gripping the mantle with one hand as I turned to face him. Families protect each other. Families stand together. Families don't point to doghouses when their own father needs shelter. Tell me, Carl, what part of that was family? His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time, he looked small, his bravado shriveling in the face of truth. Adeline tried again, her tone turning sharp. We were overwhelmed. You don't understand the pressure we were under. I stepped closer, my voice cutting through her excuses. Overwhelmed people forget to pay bills. Overwhelmed people snap at each other. Overwhelmed people don't exile their father into the cold. Stop calling it pressure. Call it what it was, selfishness. The air in the room thickened with tension. The portraits of my ancestors seemed to stare down from the walls, witnesses to this reckoning. For years I had allowed myself to be the silent provider, absorbing every slight, every dismissal, every manipulation. Not anymore. You can cry, I told her, my voice steady. You can scream. You can point to blood and call it family. But I see you now. I see who you chose to be. And I won't unsee it. Her face crumpled, but I didn't relent. Silence pressed between us, broken only by the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. For the first time in my life, I had spoken without fear of losing her love, because I finally understood it had never been love she was giving me. It had been control. And control, once broken, can never be reclaimed. The silence in the manor grew thick, heavy as stone. Carl had stopped pacing, his greedy eyes flicking from the fireplace to the chandelier to the polished floors, measuring everything in dollars. Adeline's tears slid down her cheeks, but I held my ground. I wasn't the father who bent under guilt anymore. I wasn't the man who sold his house to buy hers, only to be discarded when I had nothing left to give. Finally, I broke the silence. My voice was steady, almost too calm. If you want the truth, Adeline, it's this: your children are welcome here anytime, but you and Carl are not. Her mouth fell open, disbelief flashing across her face. You can't mean that. Dad, we're family. I looked at her evenly. Family doesn't shove their father toward a doghouse. Family doesn't replace him with strangers because money mattered more. Tommy and Lily are my blood, yes, but more than that, they're innocent. I won't punish them for your choices. They'll always have a home with me. But you chose your path. Carl's voice cut in sharp and indignant. You think you can just cut us out? You owe us. We've been taking care of you for years. The words made me laugh, a bitter sound that startled even me. Taking care of me, I cooked your meals, I watched your children, I gave you the down payment for your house, and I sat alone in a hospital bed while you ignored my calls. You weren't taking care of me, you were bleeding me dry. Adeline took a step toward me, desperation creeping into her tone. Dad, please don't do this. We can fix it. We can go back to the way things were. I shook my head. No. There is no going back. You broke something that can't be mended with apologies. This house is my proof that I'm not helpless, not dependent, and not yours to control. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing access to what I had. Carl muttered under his breath. This is insane, but the bravado in his voice was cracking. I turned toward the window where sunlight streamed across the Persian rug, the lake glittering beyond the glass. It felt like the house itself was affirming my words, standing with me against their schemes. I drew in a slow breath and said, "If you care about your children, you'll bring them here to visit. They'll know love, stability, and dignity under this roof. But you and Carl, your place here is finished." Adeline's knees seemed to buckle, and for once she had no answer. Carl tried to protest, but the fire in my eyes must have silenced him because he looked away. I stepped closer to the door and pulled it wide open. "You know the way out," I told them. They hesitated, staring at me like they were seeing someone new, someone they couldn't manipulate anymore. And they were right. The man they had once controlled was gone. The man who stood before them now belonged to himself. They didn't move at first. Adeline stood rooted near the fireplace, her lips trembling, as if words might save her, while Carl's fists clenched at his sides. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, punctuated by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. At last, Adeline whispered, "Dad, don't do this. We're your children. This house, it's part of our inheritance, too." I let the words settle, and then I answered, my tone calm, unwavering. "No, Adeline. Your inheritance was my love, my guidance, my sacrifices, the roof over your head, the food on your table, the bedtime stories I read to you when you were small. You threw that away the moment you chose money over blood, the moment you pointed at a doghouse and told me it was my place." Her face collapsed into disbelief, as though she had never imagined a world where her father would deny her. She tried again, her voice cracking. "But Dad, we were desperate. We were just trying to survive." I shook my head slowly. Survival doesn't turn into cruelty unless you allow it, and you allowed it. You let greed speak louder than love. Carl stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "You can't just cut us out like this. You're an old man. You'll need us eventually." A bitter smile tugged at my lips. "No, Carl. I don't need you. I never did. I needed honesty, I needed respect, but those were things you were never willing to give. I have everything I need right here. A roof, a name, a legacy. And I'll be damned if I let you lay a single finger on it." The silence that followed was final. It was the silence of a door closing, of a chapter ending. I walked to the oak desk in the corner of the room where Uncle Harlan's journals rested and picked up a single sheet of paper, the draft of a new will I had already begun discussing with my lawyer. I held it up so they could see the bold heading. "I'm making sure this house, this legacy, stays where it belongs, with me. And one day with the grandchildren who truly love me. Not with you." Adeline's face crumpled completely, then her tears spilling freely, but they no longer moved me. For years, I had mistaken her tears for truth. Now I saw them for what they were, tools sharpened for manipulation. She had lost her weapon. I pointed toward the front door, my voice still steady. "It's time for you to leave." Carl muttered curses under his breath, but even he knew the fight was over. He grabbed Adeline's arm, pulling her toward the door. She resisted for a heartbeat, her eyes still fixed on me, silently pleading. But I didn't waver. I stood tall in the doorway until their figures disappeared down the long drive, their car shrinking into the horizon. When the last sound of their engine faded, I closed the heavy oak door with a firmness that echoed through the halls. I turned back toward the library, the sunlight spilling across the Persian rug, and sat in Uncle Harlan's chair. My hands rested on the worn leather, my heart steady. For the first time in years, I felt whole. This was no longer the story of a man cast out into the cold. This was the story of a man who had reclaimed his dignity. 3 weeks of quiet passed after that confrontation. Days filled with the laughter of my grandchildren during weekend visits, evenings spent in the glow of the library's fire, mornings greeted by the sunlight dancing across Lake Michigan. I thought perhaps Adeline and Carl had accepted defeat, that they would retreat into the life they'd chosen. But then one afternoon the phone rang. Her voice on the other end was thin, frayed, and desperate. "Dad, please don't hang up. I know you hate me, but I don't hate you," I interrupted calmly. "I'm just not your solution anymore." There was a sharp inhale followed by sobs that sounded different this time. Raw, panicked, stripped of their usual performance. "The bank has taken the house," she blurted out. "We've missed too many payments. They foreclosed last week. We have nowhere to go." I leaned back in Harlan's leather chair, staring at the shelves lined with his journals. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter, who had pointed me to a doghouse as if I were stray, now had no roof of her own. And where I asked slowly, "Are your precious in-laws now, Vera and Eldon?" Her voice cracked. "They left. Packed up the minute they heard about the foreclosure. Didn't even say goodbye to the kids. Just gone." I closed my eyes, picturing the smug smiles they had worn as they unpacked their belongings in my bedroom, their arrogance as they stood on the porch that winter night. And now gone the moment their comfort was threatened. Uncle Harlan's words rang in my ears. Family often mistakes kindness for weakness, but fair-weather family will vanish the moment the storm arrives. On the phone, Adeline continued, her voice tumbling over itself in panic. "Carl lost his job in March. We tried to cover the bills, but the credit cards are maxed. The utilities are being shut off tomorrow. Dad, I don't know what to do. I'm scared. The kids don't know yet. Please, help us." I sat in silence, letting her desperation fill the space. Years of manipulation replayed in my mind, the doghouse, the dismissal, the way she had spoken, as though I were disposable. And now here she was, asking me to be her savior once again. Finally I asked, "What exactly do you want from me, Adeline?" Anything, she whispered through her sobs. "I'll sign papers, I'll give you legal guardianship of the kids, whatever you want. Just help us, please." Her words twisted something deep inside me. I thought of Tommy and Lily, innocent, caught in the wreckage of their parents' choices. They deserved better than instability, better than parents who valued money over dignity. I spoke slowly, clearly. "The children can stay with me, indefinitely." There was a long pause. Then her voice broken and disbelieving. "And what about Carl and me?" I looked out the window, watching a pair of cardinals building a nest in the oak tree. My answer was as steady as the lake's horizon. "You'll have to figure out your own solutions. My door is open for your children, Adeline. But not for you." Her sobs grew harsher on the other end of the line, ragged breaths between words that stumbled out like confessions. "Please, Dad, I know we've been awful. But it was stress, I swear. You know how Carl gets when he feels cornered. We weren't thinking straight. We weren't ourselves." I pressed my hand against the window pane, the cold seeping into my skin, grounding me. Outside, Lake Michigan stretched wide and unbothered, a mirror of permanence. "No, Adeline," I said softly but firmly. "You were yourselves. That's what hurt the most. You didn't break under stress, you revealed who you really are." Her breathing hitched. I could almost hear Carl in the background muttering under his breath, feeding her lines. Then faintly, his voice carried over. Tell him we can rebuild. Tell him we'll pay him back. Adeline tried again. Dad, we can make this right. If you help us now, we'll find jobs, we'll pay you back every cent. Just don't give up on us. A bitter laugh escaped me. Don't give up on you, Adeline. You gave up on me the moment you told me my place was in the yard beside a doghouse. You thought I was finished, a useless old man to be pushed aside. And now you want me to forget that, to pretend it never happened. Her silence on the line was heavy, filled with the sound of quiet tears. Then almost a whisper. What are you saying? I turned from the window and sank into Harlan's leather chair, the house groaning softly in the winter wind, as if agreeing with me. I'm saying the children are welcome here. I'll provide them stability, love, a roof over their heads. But you and Carl, this is the consequence of your choices. You will not step foot into this house. There was a crash on the other end, maybe Carl slamming something down in anger. His voice cut through sharp and bitter. You're punishing us. You think you're better than us just because you've got some mansion. Now I let the silence answer for me before finally speaking. No, Carl. I don't think I'm better. But I know this. I never threw my family into the cold. I never chose strangers over my own blood. You did. And now you're standing in the shadow of those choices. Adeline tried one last time, her voice desperate. Dad, please. If not for me, then for the kids. They need their parents. They need us together. I closed my eyes, picturing Tommy's smile, Lily's giggle as she drew me pictures of hearts with crayons. They need stability, I corrected. They need love. They need to see that choices have consequences. And if you want to be part of their lives, you'll have to prove yourselves not to me, but to them. The line went quiet except for the sound of her weeping. And then I hung up, not with cruelty, but with clarity. My home was no longer a place where betrayal could dwell. The decision weighed on me for days after that call, though not in the way Adeline might have hoped. I didn't second-guess myself. I didn't question whether I was being too harsh. What I thought about were the children, Tommy and Lily, and how to give them the stability their parents had stripped away. The following week, I met with my lawyer in town. The same oak-paneled office where Uncle Harland had drawn up his own documents now held the drafts of my new will. As I reviewed the language, I spoke with a clarity that surprised even me. The house, the land, everything here, when my time comes, it goes to Tommy and Lily. Not a cent to Adeline and Carl. The lawyer looked over his glasses at me. You're certain cutting out your own daughter is no small matter? I nodded. She cut me out first. This is not vengeance. It's protection. I'm making sure the children know love can't be traded for rent. When I returned to the manor that evening, the lake shimmered in the fading light, a calm mirror of the peace I felt inside. Tommy and Lily arrived for their first overnight stay a few days later, carrying small backpacks and wide eyes. Mom said we can stay with you until things get better, Tommy explained. His tone carried both excitement and confusion. I bent down, meeting his gaze. This is your home now. You'll always be welcome here. From that night forward, the manor filled with life. I cooked them pancakes in the mint-green kitchen, the smell of butter and syrup chasing away the ghosts of silence. We explored the attic together, dusting off Harlan's maps, while Tommy asked about every country marked in red ink. Lily claimed the sunroom as her art studio, scattering crayons and paintbrushes across a wide oak table. Their laughter echoed through the halls, softening the house's stern edges. One evening, while we sat around the fireplace, Tommy asked the question I had been expecting. Grandpa, why aren't Mom and Dad staying here too? I took a long breath, weighing my words. Because, son, sometimes adults make choices that have consequences. Your parents made choices that hurt people they loved. Now they have to work hard to show they've learned from those mistakes. Lily frowned, her small voice earnest. But you still love them, right? I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Love doesn't disappear, sweetheart. But love doesn't mean letting people treat you badly either. Sometimes the best way to love someone is to make them face the truth. They nodded slowly, as though some part of them understood. And in their eyes I saw what Uncle Harland had meant in his journals. Strength isn't shielding children from life's storms, but teaching them how to stand when the wind comes. As I tucked them into bed that night, I whispered to myself, this is the family I was meant to protect. The manor, once a sanctuary for one, had now become a home for three. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Mornings began with the sound of little feet racing across the hallways, laughter bouncing off the stone walls that had once seemed so quiet. Afternoons were spent exploring the property, Tommy learning how to hammer nails straight as we repaired an old fence, Lily painting the birds she saw perched in the oak trees. For the first time in a long while, I felt useful, not as a wallet or a caretaker taken for granted, but as a grandfather, a guide, a steady presence. Yet every Saturday, a battered Honda Civic would creep up the long driveway. Adeline and Carl arrived for their court-approved visits, thinner now, their clothes worn, their expressions marked with exhaustion. They'd lost the polished veneer they once wore so proudly. Carl's eyes no longer gleamed with arrogance. They carried the dull sheen of a man beaten down by reality. Adeline's hands were rougher, her hair unkempt, her voice softer. The children would run to them, eager and conflicted, torn between loyalty and hurt. I never interfered. I opened the door, welcomed them into the foyer, and then stepped back, watching quietly from Harlan's chair in the library. One Saturday, after the children had dragged Carl outside to see the birdhouse they'd built, Adeline approached me. She stood in the doorway of the library, her eyes on the shelves, before daring to meet mine. "Dad," she said, her voice tentative, "I want you to know we're trying. We're working every day. Carl's at a warehouse now, and I've been waitressing nights. It's hard. But we're not giving up." I closed the journal in my lap, studying her carefully. There was no defiance in her tone, no manipulation in her eyes, only fatigue and something that looked very close to humility. "That's good," I said evenly. "The children need to see that from you." Her lips trembled. Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" The question hung heavy. For years, forgiveness had been my default, offered freely, cheaply, without condition, but not anymore. I let the silence stretch before answering. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for with words, Adeline. It's something you prove with change. And that takes time. A lot of time. She lowered her eyes, nodding slowly as though she already knew the answer. "I understand." When they left that evening, Tommy and Lily hugged their parents tightly, but returned to the house without protest. Their new rooms, their new routines had given them the sense of security they'd been starved of. Watching them settle in with their books and puzzles, I realized something important. This was no longer about punishing Adeline and Carl. It was about protecting the children from the chaos their parents had created. Later, as I sat by the fire, Uncle Harlan's words came back to me again. Justice isn't revenge, it's consequence. My daughter was learning that lesson the hard way, and for once I wasn't standing in the way. By the time spring settled over Lake Michigan, Olson Manor no longer felt like a relic of the past. It felt alive again. Flowers bloomed along the walkway, laughter of children spilled from open windows, and the halls echoed not with silence but with stories being written anew. For Tommy and Lily, this house had become a safe haven. For me, it was proof that dignity could be reclaimed even after betrayal. One Sunday evening, as we cleared the dinner table, Tommy asked a question that froze the room. "Grandpa, are Mom and Dad ever going to live here again?" Lily looked up from stacking plates, her eyes wide, waiting for my answer. I sat down slowly, folding my hands on the table. "Sweetheart, your parents are working hard right now. They're learning to be stronger, to make better choices. But this house, this is a place where love and respect come first. Until they can show both, they can't stay here." The children exchanged glances, their young minds processing more than their years should demand. Tommy finally nodded, his jaw set with quiet understanding. Lily leaned against my arm, whispering, "I like it here, Grandpa. It feels happy." That night, after tucking them into bed, I walked into the library and pulled Harlan's last journal from the shelf. Inside, I had found a line that had guided me every day since I arrived. "The greatest gift we can give children is not to shelter them from storms, but to teach them how to stand tall in the rain." I read it again under the glow of the lamp, realizing it wasn't just advice, it was my duty. The following weekend, Adeline and Carl returned. Their clothes were worn, their car sputtered as it climbed the long drive, and their faces carried the weight of lives stripped down to the bare bones. They looked at the manor differently now, not as something to seize, but as something beyond their reach. Adeline's eyes lingered on her children, who ran to her with joy, but returned just as eagerly to show me their drawings and projects. For the first time, I saw in her face not entitlement, not anger, but humility. When she spoke, her voice was softer. "Dad, thank you. Thank you for giving them stability when we couldn't." I studied her carefully, weighing her words. For once, they weren't weapons, they were acknowledgments. And that was progress, even if it came too late. As the sun set over the lake, I stood on the porch, watching them drive away. Tommy and Lily waved from the upstairs window until the taillights disappeared into the trees. The air grew quiet, but it wasn't the hollow quiet of being discarded. It was the peaceful quiet of justice served. They had pointed me to a doghouse, believing I was weak. But I had built a life here that proved otherwise. The doghouse was their shame. The manor was my answer. And from this place, I would ensure that my grandchildren grew up knowing the difference between cruelty and love, between betrayal and loyalty. Looking back, I realized my daughter's betrayal was not just about a room or a doghouse. It was about value. She had decided I was worth less than rent money, less than strangers, less than her own convenience. For a long time, I had confused sacrifice with love, silence with peace. But standing in Olsen Manor with my grandchildren's laughter filling the halls, I understood the truth. Kindness only has meaning when it is respected, and love only grows where there is loyalty. I don't tell this story to paint Adeline and Carl as monsters. They are flawed like all of us, and now they are facing the consequences of their choices. But I share it as a reminder, if you are a parent, never take your children's devotion for granted. And if you are a child, never forget the hands that built your foundation, because betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it destroys trust that may never be rebuilt. My grandchildren will inherit more than this manor. They will inherit the lesson that dignity matters, that silence can be strength, and that family is defined not by blood alone, but by love and respect. Have you ever faced a betrayal in your own family? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments. I'd like to hear it. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe, and share it. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply reclaiming your worth. Thank you for listening.